I feel like I'm a work in progress with my personal style, but lately I've tried to choose things that are classic and well made and not trendy, but just work in a lot of different combinations. Quince is a great place to start for clothes like this. The fabrics are elevated, the fits are flattering, everything just sort of works without having to overthink it. Quince makes it easy to refresh your everyday look this spring with pieces that feel as good as they look. They use a lot of premium materials like European linen and organic cotton and ultra soft denim. They have lightweight linen pants and dresses and tops starting at $30 that are breathable and easy to wear on repeat. I was super excited because I needed a new handbag for the summer, and I went on the website and found a diamond-stitched sling bag that is currently winging its way to me. I'm very excited to receive it. Everything at Quince is priced like 50 to 80% less than similar brands because they work with ethical factories and they cut out the middlemen, so customers are paying for quality and craftsmanship rather than brand markup. I like the things at Quince that are made out of silk, which are almost always washable. They feel amazing on the skin, and they really are a lot less expensive than similar items elsewhere. Refresh your everyday with luxury you will actually use. Head to quince.com/KERA for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada as well. That is quince, QUINCE.com/KERA for free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/KERA.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
I absolutely love that we have assembled a room full of fellow nerds on a Friday night in this theater to talk about thorny economic concepts.
The best use of a Friday. But I'll note, I think I do see a bar over there, so we're...
It helps every time.
Yeah.
What have you learned about making difficult ideas understandable and entertaining?
Yeah, I mean, it was a true gift to get to write a book and do it with the Planet Money team, who has really honed an approach to economics, explaining the economy, and doing it through stories over more than 15 years. A key tool we use is often storytelling and looking for people who are at the center of the story, people really experiencing what's going on in the economy, whether that's, finding someone racing, a small business owner racing to get their products into the United States before certain tariffs kick in, or people, experiencing inflation, or, the policymakers or researchers trying to figure out, how to improve the economy for all of us, how to control inflation. And then I also just think, I know economics can be intimidating at times, but I also think it's just incredibly fascinating to learn about, because it's learning to understand the world better and how it works. And so I think leaning into your curiosity and the questions you have is often a great way to make economics really approachable, interesting, and fun.
You talk about the value of stories. There are so many good ones in the book, but I'm going to start with my very favorite one. Ordinarily, I don't lead off with sports, but Bobby Bonilla, who signed for the second time with the New York Mets in 1999, is now 63 years old. And he still gets $1 million a year from the Mets.
Paid like a superstar in his retirement.
Tell us what he worked out.
Yeah, so Mets fans, if there are any Mets fans in your life, bring this up, and their face will not break into a smile. They will probably not be happy to talk about it. They call this day when Bobby Bonilla gets a check from the Mets every year, Bobby Bonilla Day. It's like the opposite of a holiday for Mets fans, where they're like, oh, the boneheaded Mets, I can't believe we did this and are still doing this. We are paying a retired player more than some of our starting players. This is ridiculous. We love Bobby Bonilla and Bobby Bonilla Day at Planet Money because it really shows how saving for retirement works and the power of compounding interest and compounding returns. Because what happened with Bobby Bonilla is that when he was with the Mets for the second time, he'd been this amazing slugger in baseball, but now he was later in his career, and so he had a very high salary, but he didn't have a great year. And the Mets, they were so close, to winning it all, for the next season, they really would prefer not to pay Bobby Bonilla his $6 million a year salary. But they had signed a contract. Bobby Bonilla didn't, he was happy to collect his $6 million salary. So they came to this agreement where Bobby Bonilla would not get his $6 million salary that year. Instead, he would get it in the future. So they kind of time traveled his $6 million into the future, into these checks that he now receives every year as a retiree. And so, instead of getting $6 million, he's getting about $30 million. And that's why Mets fans are lose their minds. We're paying him $30 million and we owed him $6 million. But this is actually how saving for retirement works. This is a blueprint for retirement saving. That's what we all do. We put some of our paycheck away. We don't always save $6 million at a time, but we can do this too in a smaller form. We save some money, we put it in the stock market or other investments. And over a long time horizon of multiple decades, that can grow more than you might expect in a way that kind of breaks our brains, because our money grows a little bit every year, but then that money, that additional money we've earned, that also earns interest or grows. And it's like a snowball at the top of the hill. At first, it gets a little bit of snow, but then as it grows, it gets more and more snow with every roll. So by the time it's at the bottom of the hill, it's huge. It's grown exponentially. So Bobby Bonilla is this really fun example of just how powerful it is to save for retirement and invest.
Speaking of saving, so that year the Mets didn't have to pay him that $6 million. What did they do with that $6 million?
Yeah, they had another $6 million and they went out and got another star player that helped them. I believe they didn't win it all that year, but they got to the MLB finals. They got to the World Series.
But did they not give it to Bernie Madoff?
Okay, yeah, So there's two ways to look at what happened from the Mets' perspective. One is they saved $6 million, and then they added another star player that helped them get to the World Series, and that's that helped them sell more tickets, build loyalty to the team. This was a total win-win for both sides. There's also reporting by the New York Times, as you're alluding to, that the Mets back then were giving all their spare cash to Bernie Madoff, who then became the famous Ponzi scheme guy. And so the Mets lost a ton of money when that Ponzi scheme all fell apart, and led to really dire times for the club, where they didn't have much money and kind of tarnished for Mets fans the image of their team was associated with a Ponzi scheme. And that was the most Mets thing ever, right? To give all their money to who would become the infamous Ponzi scheme guy.
Okay, so Bobby Bonilla, I don't want to dwell too much on this, but he had a guaranteed return of 8% a year. We don't necessarily have that when we invest for retirement. But you remind us that we don't need to work very hard to beat the markets, because the experts often don't beat the markets.
Yeah, I think one chapter in the book is really an ode to index funds, which is a way of investing that's the most boring investment strategy imaginable. There's no trying to get tips from golfing buddies or something like that, or watching CNN all the time, or other business channels for tips. What you're basically doing is as much as possible just investing in the market, just broadly investing in almost all the stocks out there. And then since the economy tends to grow, your savings will also tend to grow. And there's for decades, economists, other researchers, when they've studied, even professional investors who are getting paid lots of money to try and pick the best stocks, pick winners, do very sophisticated trades. The majority of them don't do better than just you or me buying an index fund and getting to not worry about it and just focus on our own career, kids, our hobbies, and let the power of compounding growth do its work for us.
Index funds have been around for as long as I've been in a position to save for retirement. They really were, though, a major revolution, weren't they?
Yeah, I think for a long time, if you wanted to save for retirement and say you were a middle-class family, it was a little unclear what you should do. There were professional investors, but who could invest your money for you, but they were expensive and they charged very high fees. And so it was this kind of revelatory act when index funds were created. First by Vanguard, the investment firm. Wall Street hated it and also made fun of it. It's oh, you're going for average returns. You just want, enjoy your average, who wants an average investment strategy? But it really proved its worth over time. And a big part of that is just that, since this is kind of like boring investment strategy, it's very cheap. So we can pay very, very low fees for this strategy. And, if you are instead paying high fees to someone who says, I'm so smart, I'm going to pick the winners, like those fees also compound over time. So that cost, they can be quite expensive just year to year, but all that money isn't being invested. And so that's I think people might underestimate the loss from those fees as well.
Why do a lot of university endowments beat the market? What do they have going for them?
Yeah, this is one of those funny things where I think when people think about how so few people are able to beat the market, there are two exceptions. There was Warren Buffett that everyone agreed on, and then there was the Yale endowment, the people at at universities like Yale, Harvard, others that are investing, the endowment of the university for the future. And I think a big reason why is that it's just they can do things that an ordinary investor can't. They can lock up their money for 30 years, 50 years, because these endowments are meant to last more or less forever. Whereas I can't lock up my money for 30 years or 50 years. I might hope to buy a house at some point, and send them to college, or need them to retire at some point. So that's one example of how they can do things we can't, and therefore since they're able to do these kind of unusual investments, companies are generally willing to give them a higher return in exchange, because you kind of having the flexibility to get our money back at any time is really nice, but that kind of means lots of investors are able to make those investments, so it's cheaper than say what the Yale endowment can do. These kind of more unusual investments, and they offer higher returns.
Kevin Warsh has been grilled of late on Capitol Hill because he is President Trump's pick to be the next chair of the Federal Reserve. Explain why you believe, and I'm going to read this because it's a quote, why you believe it might be more important for Americans to have misplaced faith in the Fed's competence than for Fed bankers to actually be competent.
Yes. I think writing about inflation almost broke my brain, but in a very pleasant way. It's really interesting and unusual, money and inflation. And so, yeah, I think there's a way, it's almost comforting to us to think that the economy, and especially the Fed, the central bank, the people who are who are managing our money supply and trying to keep inflation low, it's almost comforting to think that the economy is like this machine, almost like a Formula One car. And then they kind of, when they try to change the interest rates, tweak the interest rates, it's like a little fine tuning on the engine of that car to make, the economy purr and be in a good place. But actually, there are all these ways that inflation is really impacted by forces that are, it's in our heads, right? So a famous example, or a common example, is that when there is high inflation, one thing that often keeps inflation high is the fact that we all expect prices to keep going up. Because you might think, oh, inflation has been 10% every year. I'm going to say to my boss, I need at least a 12% raise every year, or at least a 10% raise every year. Otherwise, I'm basically losing money every year. And then, if your boss agrees to that, well, then that's inflation. That's everyone, everyone across the economy making a higher salary every year. So that's more money in the economy that will also lead prices to go up. So there's this way where the Federal Reserve, they do things like adjust the interest rate and influence the interest rate to do things in the economy that influence spending and inflation. But if none of us believe that it's going to work, if none of us believe that they are capable of bringing inflation down, then it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to control inflation. And so that's why I do think there's this way that these people in the Federal Reserve, they have all this training in economics, maybe mathematics, related fields, but they're almost like priests in a way of high finance. They're kind of doing the rituals of the central bank to show that they are doing things to control inflation. And that does have a real effect on the economy, but there's almost a way that at times where it's almost more important that we see them doing these things and we believe that they will work, and we believe that they are competent and they will be successful, and then we in turn will expect inflation to come down, and that helps bring down inflation. It's this self-fulfilling prophecy at times.
Some economic concepts can be explained without dollars and cents. What can we learn from a glut of pickles at an Alaska food bank that they could not give away to hungry people? What can we learn from that about how prices get set?
Yeah. So the very first chapter of the book is about pickles, about a pickle problem. And so this comes from like a classic Planet Money episode that we knew had to go into the book. And our central character here is a food banker in Alaska, and she had this problem that she worked with this national organization that would send big donations from companies like General Mills to whichever food bank they thought would most benefit from the donation. Food banks around the country. So one day she gets this donation of a ton of pickles. Might have literally been a ton, and she's like, they're trying to be helpful, but it's not really helpful. Like my family's here, like they don't really want or need pickles. Also, the pickles were in these gigantic jars, like maybe like 5 gallons. And she wasn't able to, like for health, like safety regulations, she couldn't repackage them for families.
So a family has to take 5 gallons of
Yeah,
pickles.
So it just kind of sits there taking up space at the food bank. And I think, right, like she had set up this, she really wanted like fresh fruits and vegetables. And she'd set up a way so that she could get fresh fruits and vegetables shipped very cheaply to Alaska, to the food bank. But the kind of people in the central headquarters making these decisions, they didn't realize that, and they were like, "Oh, pickles will stay. They're good to have in Alaska." They just didn't quite understand her needs, and so this led to this kind of unusual situation where a number of the food bankers, like our Alaskan food banker, ended up teaming up with a group of University of Chicago economists to see if they could figure out a better system.
Delaware is another place that illustrates something interesting. It's a very tiny state that punches far above its weight in terms of its effect on the way corporations work in this country. Why are more than 2/3 of American corporations incorporated in Delaware and not in New York or wherever it is they're headquartered?
Yeah, so I remember like signing a contract for my first real job, and it said like a Delaware corporation, and I was living in San Francisco. I was like, what, Delaware corporation? What does this mean? And a lot of people may have had this experience. If a company's incorporated in Delaware, that's almost like, it's like if the company was like born in Delaware, like the hospitals in Delaware, that's where all the companies are born, even if they are headquartered and mostly do business in other parts of the country and even the world. But the fact that they are, like these companies are like born in Delaware means that they follow a lot of like the corporate law of Delaware. It's almost like their DNA is set in Delaware. It dictates what happens when there's a dispute between them and another company, different rules they follow, especially around like issuing stock, all sorts of things. And it's a little bit of a historical accident. The United States used to not have that many corporations. It was somewhat unusual. And then, after the Industrial Revolution, when you start getting more and more big companies, there was this moment where Delaware realized they had an opportunity. They made it very, very easy to incorporate in Delaware and tried to create like good rules that would make it very, easy for businesses to function. That then lots of companies would incorporate in Delaware, and this could be like the state business. They would get these fees when companies chose to incorporate in Delaware. And so it's interesting. It's a system that in some ways is, even though it's kind of accidental and weird, works out quite well, where there's this small like council of corporate lawyers in Delaware who are very, very focused on creating rules that will make corporate life easier and manage disputes between like shareholders, people who buy stock in companies, and the executives who they're trusting with their money and trusting to run the company well. They're like, it's like the princess and the pea, where if like the princess feels like 1 pea under her 7 mattresses, like that's these like lawyers in Delaware in response to like any problems that corporations might have that's like making business harder. And I think that's largely like a good thing. But it also means that this group of lawyers that's very focused on making a lot of important rules that dictate corporate life, they're mostly thinking about like shareholders, investors on one hand, and the like executives and companies on the other. And they aren't thinking as much about like the public good. And not because like they're terrible people who don't care. I've interviewed one of them who's the head of the council for a long time, and he was very thoughtful. But they kind of know if they, try to pass a rule that says, okay, now, corporations, you all need to have at least one member of your board be like a worker at your company, so workers have more of a voice in decisions. They know those companies will just say, no, we don't want to do that, and they'll go to, another state to incorporate there instead. So it's this interesting, maybe it's a little dissatisfying to say like other things that are really great about it, but there are also these downsides. But that's common in economics. Like in economics, there's often trade-offs, and there are upsides and downsides of this strange system we have where Delaware is like where all our companies are born.
You explained that the influence of Delaware has allowed a lot of companies to overlook or not be held accountable for negative externalities. This sounds like an extra credit term, so explain for us what that is.
Yeah. So an externality is something, either a benefit or a cost that's not really captured by the cost of something. So, I mean, one example might be like public radio or local news, where you could think there's lots of benefits for it, but it's not necessarily that are beyond what people are like paying for actively, or the way that someone can listen to the radio even if they haven't even paid for it. So there's, but then a negative externality is something like pollution and climate change are like the very standard examples, very important examples where, if a company is able, if they emit a lot of carbon, which has harms for all of us, but they're not paying for it in any way, that's an externality. And so I think with Delaware, it shows, there's a way where like Delaware doesn't really see it as their role to be the ones who make companies accountable for those externalities and have to pay that cost. And in some ways that's fair. I think their line is often like, well, that's something Congress should do. And that's fair, but this is also a place where like they're really kind of creating the incentives and the DNA of corporations. And it would be great if these like highly trained corporate lawyers were able to also think about the public good and make rules, so that companies were more like pro-social and thought and acted in a way that benefited all of society.
I think a lot of us have paid a weird, unprecedented amount of attention to tariff policy in the past year or so. What can we learn about the pros and cons of trade protectionism from that time when Argentina insisted a BlackBerry factory be built at the southern tip that's like the jumping off point to Antarctica?
Yeah, so these BlackBerry phones, not a factory producing BlackBerry fruits, should perhaps qualify. It's been long enough since everyone was talking about Obama with his BlackBerry. But yeah, it's funny, when I was writing about this, I had no idea that tariffs would be in the news when this book came out. But there's this fantastic case study of when Argentina in kind of the mid-aughts had a moment that might sound really familiar to a lot of us. Their president said, I want this country to manufacture things again. We're going to bring back manufacturing jobs. We're going to create new manufacturing jobs. And by using tariffs, which is essentially a tax on goods imported into the country, as well as other regulations, forced a lot of companies to manufacture things and open factories in Argentina if they wanted to sell things to Argentinians. And in particular, like through a mix of carrot and stick, got the makers of BlackBerry phones to create, to put up a factory in Tierra del Fuego, which means like the land of fire. And it's closer to Antarctica than it is to the capital of Argentina. It is absolutely not a place where you would choose to build a factory just kind of based on like economic logic. But it was kind of political logic. There were a lot of supporters of the president there.
Seems like a source of good jobs for Tierra del Fuego.
Yeah, which is like very understandable that this is a place that could benefit from good jobs, right? There are a lot of good intentions here. And it's also kind of remarkable, like BlackBerry phones were like absolutely state of the art, and they managed to like build a factory, get all the things you needed to like track dust mites in the air, so like they don't get in the phones or something like that. State of the art manufacturing in the land of fire. And for a moment, like Argentina had positive economic growth. This area was booming. It seemed quite positive. But the problem was, these phones were much more expensive than anywhere else in the world because there were all these higher costs of, building this remote place. And I think they were also, just since it took longer, they weren't as advanced as, BlackBerries made in other countries. So Argentinians, they much preferred to like buy a BlackBerry on the black market. People could like come back from a trip, put a few BlackBerries in their socks or their suitcase and sell them. And this was kind of a problem that happened across the economy in these cases, where like these factories being set up that were providing jobs, but they're producing, more expensive goods, inferior goods. Argentinians often either didn't want to buy them or they had to buy them, but now they're paying much higher prices. The factory in Tierra del Fuego eventually shut down. So this is really, I think, a cautionary tale about how difficult it can be to try and like go against the forces of comparative advantage and globalization, the kind of logic of things being produced where there is either the labor is cheaper there or there's a really great supply chain set up or whatever different kinds of advantages. And how, even someone who has all the tools of, say, a president, there's only so much they can do to really like bend the economy to their will.
Post-pandemic, a lot of employers think people do their best work in office settings. Meanwhile, a lot of workers say, no, we're more productive working from home. Who is right?
Both, neither. I think it's one of those cases where like there are trade-offs, right? Is the somewhat unsatisfying, but I think true answer. Right? So like now there were people studying remote work before the pandemic, but now we have this huge accidental experiment in remote work. And I think a lot of us got our own data about remote work. And then researchers have really like dug into this. And I think, one consistent finding is that there are lots of types of work where people just are more productive if they're remote because they can really focus. The problem, of course, is that a lot of those distractions, some of that is like that annoying guy in the office being loud or whatever, but some of those distractions are like a young colleague like asking you how to do something. So we've had, a group of economists really documented how, when a company had remote work compared to others who were working in the office, you saw some higher productivity among like the senior engineers, but then the younger workers, they didn't get as much training and mentorship. They didn't get promotions and raises. They really like faced this cost.
This show is supported by Odoo. When you buy business software from lots of vendors, the costs add up and it gets complicated and confusing. Odoo solves this. It's a single company that sells a suite of enterprise apps that handles everything from accounting to inventory to sales. Odoo is all connected on a single platform in a simple and affordable way. You can save money without missing out on the features you need. Check out Odoo at odoo.com. That's odoo.com.
How do employers decide when they want to hire somebody to perform a particular function and when they want to outsource to a contractor?
Yeah. That's really interesting because I think that's a trend we've seen and maybe something that's gone a little less noticed with remote work is that remote work really showed companies how many things, okay, if this work can be done outside of the office, that doesn't need to be done by an employee. We could subcontract that. We could get whether that's an individual freelancer or, a small firm, like that's something that could be done outside the kind of like walled garden of the corporation or of our company. And so, you asked about like, how does a company decide whether to hire an employee or, a contractor or whatnot? And I think that really comes down to like transaction costs. Right, so there's kind of this question for the company of like, if you hire someone outside the company, that can be very affordable. You just pay them like the lowest rate that the market charges. You don't have to worry about health insurance. You don't have to, if you decide you no longer need their services, like you just stop working with them. You don't have to worry about severance. It's not like disruptive in the way that layoffs are. But of course, if you tried, to contract everything out to freelancers or firms, it would get super annoying. Like if you owned like a B&B, like, in the country, like maybe you could hire one person who just specializes in flipping pancakes and like one person who specializes in X, Y, and Z. But at some point you might be like, it's better just to have, that just gets, there's so many contracts and the costs add up. It's better just to hire some full-time employees who are motivated, can do whatever gets needed done that day. But a very notable change is that like technology has made it so that a lot more jobs can be done more affordably by people who are not full-time employees, right? Like maybe companies used to have their own, delivery drivers if you're a restaurant, or big companies employed their own truckers to deliver things. But now like with GPS, with good communication tools, like you can really just like track the location of those people the entire time. That maybe tips the logic towards, outsourcing that work, not having those people be employees. It's very easy now to put like your company's data and reports and information like in the cloud. And so now, like you don't need a full-time employee who's on site, like pulling things out of filing cabinets. Your accountant or XYZ employee could be, either a small firm you hire for this or just like an independent contractor rather than a full-time employee. So that's like a big change we have seen in the economy that I think we often talk about the gig economy as like an Uber driver or someone, handing off some pad thai because they work for DoorDash. But we keep slowly seeing an increase in the number of, say, like white collar workers, desk workers, who are freelancers or, in a way, gig workers.
So those higher skilled gig workers, they get to name their own price and companies can take it or leave it, but they might do those deals once or twice a year and companies see people coming through all the time. How do people figure out how much to charge?
Yeah, there's this kind of information asymmetry. I think, for the book, I spoke with someone who's in this position, an engineer who had worked at SpaceX, startups, someone whose skills were very in demand. But she didn't really know. She's like, should I divide my former salary by like the number of hours I might work every year? And that's how much I should charge. Like that was really kind of like a key problem she faced. And so it was interesting in her case, what she ended up doing is she found these agents, like a small firm of agents, whose kind of whole philosophy was that they used to represent like people in the music business, like famous musicians, and then they'd realize like, oh, there are all these like people in Silicon Valley who can maybe benefit from being represented by an agent too. They're like great at coding, but maybe not great at negotiating, a salary or, in this case, like their hourly rate or a project fee. And so by working with these agents, that was a way that she kind of leveled the playing field and solved this information asymmetry where, the companies knew exactly how valuable her work would be. She didn't have a lot of data to get a sense of like how valuable her work might be, but these agents, since they represented lots and lots of different engineers, they had that information, they had a better sense. And she had this experience of kind of the first time she works with an agent, the agent being like, well, how much do you think you would charge for this, do this project over several months? And she said a number, and the agent's like, I think we can go higher. And she's like, yeah, he was absolutely right. And that's generally been the trend, because they do have that like information and data, which I think like we can learn from too, even if you're not someone who's like gonna hire an agent to represent you, even if you're in a full-time job, like standard salary work, rather than this kind of more gig project-based work. Simple things like a lot of like states have passed salary transparency laws. So that means you can often like pay attention to job postings for jobs that are similar to yours and keep track of like where the salaries are for different experience levels in your field. There are ways you can kind of be your own agent and make these insights work for you as well.
The economics of online dating is a really interesting field of study. I mean, all the ads want to make you think that they are going to deliver you a lifetime of happiness or at least a couple of years, but don't they have an incentive to keep you single?
A lot of laughs for that one. Maybe a lot of people have experience with this. I was using dating apps when I was writing this book, and I had a lot of experience with this and thought about this a lot. And so there's something really interesting going on with dating apps where to an actual very surprising degree, like the dating app Hinge, for example, has said in the past that they designed their algorithm, which matches people, shows people profiles of people they might be interested in, by using Nobel Prize winning economics research, which is quite interesting and fascinating to me. But at the same time, yes, if a dating app does such a good job matching people up that they very quickly start dating someone and delete the app, that's bad for their business, right? So there is this tension where dating apps are incentivized to help people meet people they would be interested in. Otherwise, no one would use the service. But there is a disincentive that I really think they are aware of, that if they need to keep people on the platform, otherwise it is quite bad for their business. And so this is, really this tension within dating apps, which are now the dominant way that Americans meet each other and find girlfriends, boyfriends, spouses, partners.
Have you found any way to game the apps?
I thought a lot about this. I don't know if my strategies were successful. But one thing I will note is that I think, for people who live in big dating markets, like a major city, I think people often have a tendency to try and present themselves as agreeably as possible, just kind of as a generally nice, cool person. And maybe all those people should be doing the exact opposite. Because actually, when you're using a dating app in a major market where there are thousands and thousands of people, your problem is actually not, being kind of agreeable enough for lots of people. Your problem is really you know, showing a side of yourself that will be really appealing to some people. And it might actually be a plus if you show a side of yourself that's really like unappealing to a lot of other people. Not like I'm a jerk, like you don't want to go out with me, but like, like if you love waking up on the weekends at 6 a.m. to go hiking or do X or Y, it's great, I think, to publicize that, because that will turn some people off who want to be in bed till noon. But like, you might not want to date those people. And then it's kind of like putting up the bat signal to people who are like, oh yeah, like my ex, like always just wanted to like sleep in. He was so boring. She was like, never wanted to do these cool things with me on the weekends. So yeah, I'm interested in meeting this person. So I think, I think there's power in kind of like showing your personality in a way and not being afraid of showing something that you think might deter some people, because that might actually be what helps you. That might be the signal that helps you meet someone who you would both be really excited to spend time together.
Upward economic mobility is like the core of the American dream. How did economists start to realize that it's not so much how people live that determines mobility, but where they live?
Yeah. So there was this really interesting, huge economic experiment that took place several decades ago, where HUD, like the federal agency that works on housing, they thought, well, like, they manage these like big apartment buildings where people live, for free or very reduced rent. They also gave people vouchers to help them afford apartments and housing. But they said, like, there's this kind of hypothesis: what if we could not only give people a place to live, like keep a roof over their head, but what if by helping them live in an area with less poverty, maybe with better schools or better access to jobs, what if that could actually lead them, to live a better life, to, you get better jobs, higher incomes, better education for their kids. And so there was this, what HUD did was very intentionally framed as an experiment. We're going to test this idea. So they signed up thousands of families who lived in these apartments. And then people who opted in and said they were interested, they were then put in a lottery. And there were kind of some people who were the control group, to put in scientific terms, who like, they just kept living in, say, the project or apartment building where they're currently living. Others got a voucher, but they could only use this voucher to help pay for their rent if they moved to a low income neighborhood, or excuse me, an income with very low poverty rates. And at first the results were kind of disappointing. You didn't see much difference. Like the families who made this move to low poverty neighborhoods, you didn't really see lower unemployment rates. The kids' educational attainment wasn't necessarily much higher. Like it seemed like a bit of just kind of a bummer, like a failed experiment. But then you had a group of economists who were interested in economic mobility revisit the data, because they were looking at kind of like IRS tax data. They had access to all this like people's tax returns, but all anonymized. And they started seeing these patterns where they were looking for like places, like they were like looking for people who did have economic mobility. Where are there people who like, started in relative poverty, but moved up to the middle class or even higher? And they started seeing almost like dots on a map. It looked like they were kind of like some parts of the United States, the American dream was alive and kicking, and other parts it was dead. And they looked at this experiment and they realized, oh wow, like the final results of the study, that final study just happened too soon. Like when they looked at the data again, maybe it was like 10 years later, I forget exactly, but they're looking later. Now, a lot of the families who had young children when they moved, those children were now like in the workforce. And they saw they were doing much more successful, probably thanks to, as the data indicated, because of this move to low poverty neighborhoods. So this was the sign that like where you are born, where you live, especially during your formative years, can be really powerful in shaping your economic destiny. But I think it's also really important to mention that their takeaway from this is not like where you are born is your destiny. What they're really trying to do is understand like, okay, what was so powerful about moving to those low poverty neighborhoods? And in fact, what they found is that, some low poverty neighborhoods didn't help and others did. There are really kind of other ingredients that were more important. And in particular, they really honed in on like social connections and social capital. It seemed like the places where families saw economic mobility and like the kids went on to achieve the American dream of kind of like, parents getting to see their kids live better than they did, higher incomes, maybe go on to, good jobs, buy a home. That was often, achieved more in these neighborhoods, cities, where people had more connections. Maybe there's more interacting at, parks, social groups, church, or other places of worship. So I think they both found that place is really powerful in shaping our economic destiny, but also that even more so, it seems like there are certain ingredients there that maybe we can understand to help people like all over the country and to make sure that the American dream isn't just alive in like a few, some dots on the map, but all over the country.
Okay, we're going to up the nerd factor now and talk about zoning.
Oh, please. Yeah.
What are some public policies that actually can address the shortage of affordable housing that we see, especially in many large cities around the country?
Yeah. I mean, I think economists really key in on zoning, as you said, as something where cities are really holding themselves back, and in other parts of the country where rent and housing is extremely expensive. And so it's probably helpful to distinguish between zoning that, there's kind of like the original zoning was trying to say, okay, we won't have like, heavy industry, we want somewhere else and not in residential areas. But the zoning that I think economists, citizen advocates, policymakers are really talking about is the type of zoning that says, okay, in a residential area, you can only have a single family home, right? Like there has to be a house. In some cases, the house has to be, it can't even just be a small house. It has to be a big house. There are these really specific restrictions that limit, how many people can live in an area, the density of that area, the size of the buildings that, more or less just ban apartment buildings, often ban something as simple as like a duplex, which would just be like turning one big house into, two apartment buildings, or, that each floor is a unit or something like that. And so like, in housing, supply and demand exists. And if you really restrict the building of new homes, new apartment buildings, that's less supply, and that's making housing more expensive for everyone. And so it's very understandable that, people choose a neighborhood. They might buy a house there, spend so much of their income to choose that neighborhood, and they don't want it to change. But if all of us make that choice, then we're really preventing future generations from having a place to live. We're shutting off people who want to move to cities where there's so much economic opportunity. We're preventing them from accessing that. And we're preventing more economic growth. Like, I think this is a way that a lot of economists think, like, if you're looking for a way to really increase economic growth in the US in a way that would benefit lots of people, like broadly benefit all Americans, like making it easier to build in big cities, these places with access to jobs, great jobs, education, could be a really powerful force for improving people's lives.
We've talked so much about money tonight, but you remind us in the book that the most precious and limited resource any one of us has is time. So talk a little bit about Schrödinger Saturdays.
Yes.
and what we can do to effectively, economically manage our time.
I should first admit, I'm so pleased you brought up Schrödinger Saturdays, because I really did. I was like, I really would love to coin a term that people start saying. So like, if you all start talking about Schrödinger Saturday all the time, I would be very, very pleased and delighted. I should probably explain what it means or what I mean by it. I think in the book I talk about how weekends are not. It's not just like the calendar. It's like weekends are like a human invention. Weekends didn't have to exist. And in fact, in the Soviet Union at one point, Stalin thought these weekends are very inefficient. He just like changed the calendar because he thought, well, if we get rid of weekends, then people, like these factories will be humming every day of the year. So workers went from all having like the same day off to, they kept roughly the same amount of days off during the year, but now their days off were kind of evenly distributed throughout the week. And this was extremely unpopular because these workers were like, okay, well, I have the day off, but like my kids are in school, my wife is working, like this isn't a holiday, this isn't a day off, like what am I gonna do? Like it just made the value of their free time, it made their free time less valuable. And so I absolutely love sometimes having like a free Tuesday where everyone else is busy and I can go do things and there are no lines, there's no traffic. Well, rush hour traffic, but like there are things that would normally be very busy in the weekends that you get to enjoy. But I think, right, like a lot of the value of free time is being able to enjoy it with other people. So I think we saw, in the Soviet Union, like Stalin, not a famously flexible person, like reversed his decision and went back to, workers having the same day off so that they could enjoy it together. And so I think this is why but we also see like a similar threat to weekends today, right? We see it in a few different places. One is kind of like always on work culture, where like desk workers, white collar workers might be checking their phones and emails all weekend. And so this way that they're never fully unplugging, and they might kind of like dash off to do some work. Like that's what Schrodinger's Saturday is, right? Like, do you have a weekend or is it not a weekend? You don't really know until Saturday happens and you check your email to see if you're actually free. There's other versions too, like, a lot of retail, they might have people come into the store, and then they have software that tries to predict how busy the store will be that day, maybe based on how many people have started coming in. And if they don't see a lot of demand, they might say to, maybe half the workers who came in the day, actually, just go home, we don't need you today. And they've just, they might have done a really long commute to come in. They weren't able to make plans for that day because they expected to be working. Like that's Schrodinger's Saturday. Like they didn't actually know if they had a weekend or not. I think that's one way economic thinking can help us think about like the value of our free time, things that aren't just money. Because there's this way that like the weekend is a really powerful technology. And by making it so that people could enjoy it together, like I don't think like bottomless mimosa brunch exists without the weekend. Like there have to be a lot of people who have that free morning and will make
Makes for
plans.
an interesting day at work.
Yeah. I mean, maybe some people, power to you if you do the bottomless mimosa brunch, then go to work. Similar for like lots of concerts and festivals. Like, a world where like people's day offs are like randomly distributed throughout the week. I don't think you get these like big gatherings for sports games or certain festivals or concerts. And so like there's a really powerful way that like the way we've organized our time has like enabled all these things that bring us joy, both just spending time with friends, but also these activities that kind of are built on top of the platform of a weekend. And so I think, that's a reason to be like really, like it's hard if your job just says this is what you have to do. But I think it's really worth fighting for the weekend because it is a way that we get more like joy and happiness out of a very limited resource, which is our time.
That is our time. Alex, what a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Thank you all so much for being here. This is wonderful.
Alex Mayasi is a longtime contributor to Planet Money and author of the book Planet Money, a guide to the economic forces that shape your life. We spoke in front of a live audience at the Kessler Theater in Dallas, and you can hear an extended version of our conversation in the podcast for this show, available wherever you get your podcasts. Think is distributed by PRX, the Public Radio Exchange. Again, I'm Chris Boyd. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.